Good afternoon and welcome to Stewarding Natural Resources for Intergenerational Wellbeing through the ESA. My name is Chandler Randall and I am the Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am so delighted to welcome everyone to today's webinar. ELI is proud to offer programming on cutting-edge issues in environmental law and policy, and it is such an honor to have you join us today for this special program. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for a Q&A session. Please submit your questions through GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send in your questions as soon as you think of them. I would like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their expertise to this webinar. And while they will be introduced briefly, their full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. As we begin, I would like to briefly introduce today's esteemed panel. Dr. Tundi Agardi is a leader in marine conservation with extensive field and policy experience in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, North America, and the Pacific. Her work has focused first and foremost on articulating the value of the ocean for humanity and the planet. Over decades in the conservation NGO community, she launched marine programs at WWF, Conservation International, Forest Trends, led the coastal portion of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and has run her own nonprofit called Sound Seas. Jake Lee specializes in endangered species law, policy, and science. He leads the Innovation Center's Biodiversity Program, which focuses on developing innovative strategies to conserve imperiled species. This work includes nearly every aspect of the Endangered Species Act, especially consultations, recovery planning, and funding. Jake holds a bachelor's from Drexel University and a JD from Cornell University Law School. Jason Rylander is the Senior Endangered Species Counsel of the Defenders of Wildlife. Jason has litigated endangered species and habitat protection cases in federal court across the country since joining Defenders in 2005. His cases have involved gray wolves, polar bears, pygmy owls, and many other imperiled species. Jason earned a BA in government from Cornell University and a JD from the William and Mary School of Law. Finally, Lorena Wada first started working for the Service with Refugees in 1981 and has worked as a listing coordinator for the Southwest and the Pacific Islands, as well as being an instructor for Section 7 Interagency Cooperation Training. She received her bachelor's in zoology from the University of Hawaii and her master's in wildlife and fisheries science from the University of Arizona. She currently works in the Pacific Islands Fish and Wildlife Office as the Resource Team Manager. Our panel today is going to examine many issues pertaining to endangered species and the Endangered Species Act. Lorena will start things off with the practical considerations in implementing the Endangered Species Act. Tundi will follow by highlighting the importance of the ESA's umbrella protection approach through the lens of marine life. Jason will take a more philosophical approach by examining the intent of the ESA, whether this is being achieved, and how we can improve species protection further. And Jake will conclude the panel discussion by examining how species and biodiversity can be preserved across future generations, especially considering the impact of climate change and species that are unlikely to recover. Thank you all so much, and with that, I will turn things over to our first speaker, Lorena Wada. Thank you. I think you were on mute. Sorry about that, Lorena.
Sorry, I'm working off of the phone, not the computer. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for attending our panel. As Chandler said, my name is Lorena Wada, and I was born and raised on the island of Oahu in a place called Kawaihoa. And I currently live in a place called Palolo with my 3 daughters. Chandler, I'm having difficulty moving the slides. It's not working again. So could you please move the slide for me? Thank you so much. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and how we implement the Endangered Species Act and achieve ecosystem protection through the work that we do. Next. So the Endangered Species Act itself, through the purposes of the act, one of the first and main one is supposed to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered species and threatened species depend may be conserved. So while the intent of the ESA is to protect ecosystems, the actual way that it's written is more species-specific mechanisms. Next. So what I'm going to do is actually go through the main sections of the Act that the Fish and Wildlife Service implements that have to do with ways that we have been able to accomplish some of the ecosystem protection, even though mechanisms are species-specific. Most of my examples, or the primary focus of my examples, will be from the Pacific Islands because that's primarily where I work. But there will be a couple of examples that I'll show that are more widespread across the country. The examples that I show are also indications of how the service is implying this across the board throughout the country and in other offices and stations where the service exists. So the first section is section 4 that will cover determination of endangered and threatened species. This is where we do our listing, designation of critical habitat, and recovery. So recovery plans are here. Within the Act itself, it requires us to do them on a species by species basis. Next. So when that happens, typically the services use one species to cover a lot of areas. And probably one of the most famous and most widely publicized and earliest was for the northern spotted owl and the Northwest Forest Management Plan, which was done in 1994. It protected or worked on, the service worked with the Forest Service and other agencies, federal agencies, to protect large swaths of old growth forest, with the northern spotted owl as being the key species. The other well-publicized, more recent sort of species kind of wide conservation that covered large swaths of land was the greater sage-grouse. Only this was not for a listing or a listed species, but something that was done to preclude listing, but used one particular species and then large scale coverage. And this was through a conservation agreement that was signed in 2015. Next. In the Pacific Islands, in the Pacific Islands, one of the examples that we have is on the island of Guam. So it's the Guam kingfisher, where the service has signed a memorandum of agreement with the Navy, who manages large-scale swaths of land out there. And the Guam kingfisher has land set aside specifically by the Navy to protect large-scale limestone forests and commits them to put in restoration. So they fund restoration works for these types of areas. The other example we have in the island of, or in Hawaii, is a very special kind of listing for Oahu tree snails. Oahu tree snails are the only listed entity that's an entire genus. And so when we work on protecting this species, which are primarily found in wet forests, we cover large swaths of area where we work to protect, remove threats, and when we do those kinds of things, it actually protects a lot of endangered plants. In the US, there are over 1,600 listed species, and of the 1,600, close to 600 of them occur in the Pacific Islands. Next. So in the Pacific Islands, we have to work really well to be able to find a new way, creative way to list species, to do critical habitat designations and do recovery plans. So what we've discovered is a way to do it island level by island. And so when we list species, even though everything has to be done species by species, we're able to group them by island, by system, so the type of habitat that they occur in, and then by threat. So you'll actually see a larger picture when you look at what the threats are, what species share those kind of common threats, and in what types of habitat. For critical habitat designations, the same thing. for every listed species we have, we overlaid the critical habitat and then combine all that together. So by island-wide, you'd actually see larger swaths of area that needs to be protected for all these listed species. Same for the recovery plans. We manage the recovery plans and talk about restoration and implementation of recovery, threat management, all by island. Next. Okay, Section 5 of the Act talks about land acquisition. And for the Fish and Wildlife Service, in particular, the land acquisition comes under refuges and monuments. There are over 850 million acres of land, submerged lands, and waters, of which a little over 700 million actually are marine monuments. And all those marine monuments occur in the Pacific Islands that we manage. Next. Section 6, oh, can you go back one? Section 6 of the Act is cooperation with the states, and we do management or cooperative agreements with individual states, and we provide allocation of funds. In the Pacific Islands, one of the ways that we have used those funds to work with the states is in establishing what we call watershed partnerships on various parts of islands. We cooperate with the state, ourselves, with private landowners, as well as nonprofit and local community organizations to actually work on restoring or protecting and conserving main areas that protect our watersheds. Next. Section 7 is interagency cooperation, and 7A1 requires all federal agencies to utilize their authorities in furtherance of the purposes of the Act. Next. So the primary way that the Fish and Wildlife Service helps to make that happen is through the development of conservation measures. So during early coordination, we talk to agencies that are coming to us for consultation, and we work in with them ways to avoid or minimize impacts to listed species, and conservation measures tend to, depending on the size or the scope of the project, focus on restoration or stabilization, large-scale level areas. In addition, under the 7A1, we also work with agencies doing larger scale management plans that cover broader, far more landscape level impacts. And typically for like in the Pacific, we work very closely with the military on their integrated natural resource management plans. Next. 7A2 requires all federal agencies to ensure that any action they authorize, fund, or carry out does not jeopardize or adversely modify or destroy designated critical habitat. Next. So typically what happens is, can you go back? I'm sorry, can you go back one? So typically what happens is under consultation, prior to that, we do early coordination and we work with agencies to avoid and minimize again, and then basically to set out like redesigning or restructuring their projects so they can not bifurcate areas, or we kind of work on edge effects and those type of larger ecosystem level functions. Okay, next. So Section 10 are the exceptions, and they're primarily there for the Section 9 prohibitions. And for Section 10, the primary thing that we look at is the 10A1B, which are permits for incidental take for non-federal parties and entities. These are sort of the flip side of the federal Section 7 consultation work. And this is where we work with non-federal parties to manage their large-scale incidental take. Next. So typically with regard to ecosystem management and trying to look for those kinds of things, preserving and protecting as the intent of the ESA asks us to, the ongoing challenges we have are pretty obvious. There are changes in administration, And when that happens, our direction and focus often changes, and how we have to, what we are actually working on, which can often derail large-scale landscape protections when you're trying to work with multiple people. Funding is always an issue. As we know, there's always never enough people and never enough money to get the things done that we need to get done. When you talk about large landscape level ecosystems, you're often talking about many land ownership and managers that you have to deal with. And so bringing them all together takes a lot of time. And then finally, especially for areas that are for us in the Pacific Islands, our islands are very limited in size for housing everybody and maintaining the kind of growth that everybody has. So we have a lot of diminishing intact and connected ecosystems. And once those kind of disappear, we're sort of out of luck. Next. So right now, back up one. Okay, so right now, what the service is doing, at least in the Pacific and most of the other areas, is our emphasis is on building landowner and land manager relationships. So it's a long-term position here, and working to build those things through things like our partners program, where we provide funding, or when we are talking to them about critical habitat designation, which even though private parties don't have any requirements for critical habitat, a lot of landowners here in the Pacific just don't like to see that happening. So they work with us very closely to do things that protect large-scale land systems, so they won't need to be designated critical habitat. In addition, when we're talking about intergenerational things, one of the main things is well-being, is talking to and establishing contacts and involving local communities. Every community here, and I'm sure occurs across the continent, is very different depending on where you are. So even though we're small islands, different sides of the islands behave differently. And so just because one community does something or wants something doesn't mean another does. So we need to work very closely when we're talking about long-term conservation and protection, so that communities understand why that's an important part of the consideration. Lastly, it's been a nice, really good push here in the Pacific Islands. We've been working on that for a while, but it's really good now that the agency as a whole are really looking at inclusion of guidance and knowledge from host cultures. So here in Hawaii, we have the Native Hawaiian community that we reach out to, and they have a host of experience and knowledge about how to preserve and protect entire systems. They really talk about things like what we call ahupua'as, and ahupua'a is like kind of like a pie shape. So you're talking from mountaintop to the reef. So it goes all the way down to the ocean and within the ocean. And we cover all those kinds of bringing those things in by making those contacts and working on bringing that knowledge in and including it in the way that we do our work. Next. One other thing we're trying to do is create and innovate tools. I'm sorry, can you go back one? And so the tools, the most recent one that we have been using here in the Pacific Islands are distribution modeling and landscape scale modeling. These are really very neat tools that incorporate ranges of species, habitat types, the quality that's necessary, and other things. Next. The distribution modeling and landscape scale modeling can also include projections for current and future climate by incorporating temperature, precipitation, and annual variability. We've been using these things to provide large landscape scale conservation targets for now, like where we should be protecting right now and in the future. So we can project like about 70 years into the future as to where we're going to go. So a lot of our low islands that happen to be in the Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Monument, we are looking to do a lot of translocations to bring birds in up into the higher islands, the main islands, and looking at these modeling as to where we should be protecting those kinds of things as sea level occurs, sea level rises and storms and things like that probably will be washing over a lot more of these lower islets. These scale modeling tools really help us to, when we see across the board where we need to protect, we aim all the rest of our conservation efforts towards these areas and looking at that. Next. So our future is basically the same as almost always, right? We are working to use the implementations of the requirements that we have under the law and so the statutes, our regulations, and our policies to do. And we're always striving for better outcomes. We will continue to adapt and use as creative and innovative ways to meet all the challenges that we face. And within Hawaii, our Native Hawaiian culture very much focuses on the intergenerational. When we protect areas or we manage areas, we're required to actually commit to 800 years. Now, of course, a person can't do that by themselves, but it basically goes where you actually teach. So we involve the community, we reach out and educate and make people really aware and want to be involved in the restoration work that we do. So I thank you very much for all your time, and I appreciate all of you being here. So mahalo and thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Lorena. That was a really, really nice overview of how we implement the ESA at the Fish and Wildlife Services. I will now turn things over to Tundi Agardi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chandler, and thank you, Lorena. I'm going to use Lorena's very rich and detailed description of how the ESA plays out in the Pacific Islands and use that as a kind of jumping off point to take a broader look and look at intergenerational equity issues and how the ESA can deliver on these in indirect ways as well. And I'll be speaking specifically about marine endangered species as that is my expertise. So ESA, we all know, is a very, very powerful tool. It's arguably the strongest law that exists in the world for saving species. And as of 2019, I guess the figure is 291 endangered species or threatened species have been prevented from going extinct in the US. So we know that it's very powerful. It applies to terrestrial and marine species equally. And it has done a lot of good in terms of providing a safety net for threatened and endangered species. But we need to ask the question, can it do actually more than save threatened species and their critical habitats that they rely on? And we ask the question, is the Endangered Species Act well suited for providing intergenerational well-being well into the future? As Lorena mentioned, 800-year timeframes are many, many generations into the future. But how does the law actually do that both directly and indirectly? Sorry, there's a little lag with the... Okay, so I just wanted to mention what we mean by intergenerational well-being, or at least what my interpretation of it is. It refers to the ability of people to live a good life, a life that they value. And it goes well beyond, we know, economic or financial well-being into areas of health, education, relationships, safety, and even spirituality. We know that well-being relies on all four capitals, so the economic capital, social capital, human capital, but all three of those capitals are actually very reliant on natural capital. And without natural capital, we have no human well-being whatsoever. So the most critical step to preserving the well-being in future generations is to avoid points of no return, to make sure that we do not close the door on any opportunities in the future, and that we prevent all species extinctions possible. So I'm going to be again speaking to marine endangered species, and I want to just mention that there are many of them listed as both threatened and endangered under the ESA. They include the charismatic megavertebrates that we all know and love, the marine mammals, sea turtles, other species that are so important for generating public interest in the plight of the oceans and having people connect to the sea and to the web of life there. But the Endangered Species Act also covers iconic species that are perhaps just as charismatic, maybe not as mega, but charismatic vertebrates like the salmon species that are listed, iconic species also like the abalone. So we have fish, we have marine mammals, we have invertebrates listed. And then the third group of marine species that are covered under the ESA are foundation species, things like coral species that are critically important for providing important ecosystem foundation. So these marine species all contribute to intergenerational well-being. They provide food security because of the role that they play in maintaining food webs and in maintaining productivity. Even if they themselves are not consumed, they play an important role in providing food security to many, many coastal people. They are also critically important in providing livelihoods for people through ecotourism and other livelihoods. They're important for safety, and it's one of the components of well-being. So when we think about coral reefs, for instance, and their role in buffering land from storms or in disaster risk mitigation. These species are also critically important in education and awareness raising and in spiritual well-being. And it's fascinating to note that, even people in the Midwest who have never seen the ocean, in a poll that was done about 25 years ago now, I'm giving away my age, but anyway, a poll that was done many years ago suggested that even people that haven't had contact with the ocean feel some kind of spiritual link to the sea and to the animals and organisms within it. So we know that the biodiversity as a whole, the marine biodiversity, contributes in this way to intergenerational well-being. And when we try and assess the degree to which these factors are important, we tend to refer to these kind of values or benefits as ecosystem services. And I'm not going to go into the details of this, but just to say that all species that are in the web of life contribute to these ecosystem services, and removing any one of them can start an unraveling, which leads to a decrease in the ecosystem service flows and in the values that people derive from nature. So we know that well-being is supported by these ecosystem services, and that in order to maintain human well-being, that we need to maintain these ecosystem services. That in turn requires that we conserve ecosystems, and that in turn requires that we protect those species that are threatened by human activity to the extent that we can. So this is all interconnected, and the conserving ecosystems and the protecting species, as Lorena said, are both in the intent of the ESA, and the actual mechanisms are both covered for protecting species and for doing land and sea management under the ESA. So let's just zoom into how the ESA might contribute directly and indirectly to intergenerational well-being and to intergenerational equity. So we've heard already that ESA provides a safety net for species that are facing extinction. And that's the way that we avoid these irreversible losses. So we don't close the door on any species in the future and any of the ecological processes that species is involved in the future. We do everything we can to prevent the extinction of species so that we preserve the web of life. But the ESA, and part of that is, of course, criminalizing takings, including harassment. So not only the actual taking of the actual taking of species or killing of individuals listed on the Act, but also anything that would imperil their ability to live and reproduce. But the Act also requires management, as we've heard, to maintain the population viability, prevent habitat loss, and remove the drivers of degradation. And in effect, the Act indirectly safeguards ecosystem services by preserving the web of life and by maintaining these critical habitats. So the ESA has a role in protecting whole ecosystems with listed species that we can think of as umbrella species. If we get it right with the species that are listed, many of which, again, play incredibly important roles, functionally important roles in the ecosystem. They may be apex predators like the scalloped hammerhead shark you see here, or they may have other importance, such as the corals that provide foundation living space, essentially, for a whole suite of species. So if we can get this umbrella species protected, then we protect whole ecosystems along with it. But the ESA also has some indirect effects that help with the intergenerational well-being and the role that ecosystems and natural capital plays in that well-being. So the ESA really helps us further our understanding of these ecosystems and the species within them. The law mandates that we monitor the populations, so we are constantly keeping track of species status. We monitor for Endangered Species Act violations, so that we know to some extent the ways that humans are impacting these species in the future, into the future. We also monitor the habitat, as Lorena mentioned, and as she mentioned, there's a lot of modeling going on to anticipate future conditions and to make sure that the management is as adaptive as possible so that we can keep up with the changing conditions. So the ESA also has a really important role in giving a face to threatened species, and that's particularly important on the marine side because we have many, many species that are hidden from view. We're not marine animals ourselves. We live on land. Many of us are lucky enough to get to the sea occasionally, but much of what is in the sea is a mystery, and the Endangered Species Act, kind of by profiling species that are threatened with extinction, and through all of the communications, both through government agencies that work with these species and manage these species, and NGOs and other community groups and so forth. It really allows the public to connect not only with these species, but with ocean ecosystems more broadly. It also provides us, I think the Endangered Species Act and the listings really help provide a sense of place for the ocean bits. And I say this because we have a sense, I think this is not true in the Hawaiian culture, but for many of us in the Western culture, we tend to think of the seas as kind of being homogeneous under a blanket of something that looks very similar everywhere in the world. And without a sense of place, without identifying specific places that are particularly important for species survival and recovery, we kind of are overwhelmed at the scale of the oceans. So this providing a sense of place, being able to really identify the critical habitats that endangered species rely on, for their survival is really helpful in helping people get a sense of individual parts of the ocean that are most important to protect. And again, helps them also connect to the sea in ways that they might not be able to otherwise. The ESA also has a really important role to play, not only in setting conservation priorities. So when you have a listing, a lot of attention and resources go to trying to protect the species and develop recovery plans that are realistic and implement those plans. But also to really think about targeting investments for restoration. So not just protecting the status quo as it is, but trying to remove some of the drivers of degradation or some of the causes for population decline, and help promote recovery. So this is critically important because we have many issues, particularly in the marine environment, where everything comes together and there isn't private property, there aren't private property rights. So we have an amalgam of issues all in the kind of commons area. And we really need to prioritize the limited resources that we have to get maximum bang for the buck. And so these priority setting exercises are really aided by the information that the ESA work that Lorena and other people do in the federal agencies and in the state agencies is really guided by the information coming out of these agencies on the species and their habitats. The ESA, I mentioned this already, but I'll say it again, the ESA has a real important role in raising awareness, not just awareness about these species, but also awareness about nature more generally, about how species and ecosystems are interconnected, how they are also interconnected to humans. So the whole web of life, including us, and help people really understand what the future might bring in terms of not only the recovery of species, but also our own destiny on the planet. So just to sum up, I'd like to just say that, again, the role of the ESA in providing intergenerational equity and well-being is that, most importantly, it helps avoid points of no return. And that's critically important because they are points of no return, and we can't recover species once they're lost. The ESA allows ways to kind of, through perceptions and furthering understanding and generating political will, give voice to those species that have no voice. And the ESA really allows us to safeguard our common heritage. And this is, again, particularly important in the marine environment, where we don't have private property rights, where everything in the sea is the common heritage of mankind, actually, and agencies are, very much working together through the Section 7 part of the Act to do whatever they can to manage use and prevent degradation and prevent the loss of individuals in these listed species. So the ESA is really important for allowing those kinds of, allowing ecosystems to stay healthy and diverse, allowing these ecosystem services and the values that humans get from nature to continue to flow, and to continue to flow to the widest group, a stakeholder group possible across many generations. So with that, I think I am done, and I'll hand it back to Chandler. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tundi. I thought that was a really nice overview and definition for us to follow for the intergenerational well-being. I really appreciate it. With that, I will now hand things over to Jason. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Chandler, and thanks to the Environmental Law Institute for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I want to zoom back even a little bit further and talk about what the Endangered Species Act is, what it is not, and what we may need in order to address the biodiversity crisis for present and future generations. I suddenly also cannot move my slides, so that's unfortunate. All right, I guess I'll call it out. If you could skip one more. Maybe it's over here. Maybe if I try it this way. Okay, maybe this one will work. Okay. So just for some context, many scientists now believe that we are facing the 6th mass extinction. Only this one is almost entirely human caused. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services concluded that the health of ecosystems on which we and all other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. Up to 1 million animal and plant species are on the verge of extinction due to human activity. Similarly, the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet Index found that global animal, bird, and fish populations have plummeted more than 2/3 in less than 50 years. Another study found that 3 billion birds have disappeared in North America alone. This is all literally within my lifetime. As Wendell Berry once said, "It is the destruction of the world in our own lives that drives us half insane, and more than half." Indeed, the one process now going on that will take millions of years to correct is the loss of genetic and species diversity by the destruction of natural habitats. This, E.O. Wilson warns, is the folly our descendants are least likely to forgive us. But here in the United States, we have an important and successful tool to help address the biodiversity crisis, and that is the Endangered Species Act. Congress passed the ESA nearly unanimously in 1973 out of a growing realization that our natural heritage was in peril and needed to be preserved. In Section 2 of the law, Congress declared that various species of fish, wildlife, and plants were going extinct as a consequence of economic growth and development, untempered by adequate concern and conservation. And Congress further recognized that many more species were in danger of extinction and were incredibly valuable both to the nation and its people. So with these values in mind, Congress set forth an ambitious goal. The Endangered Species Act would not only address activities directed at species themselves, such as hunting and trapping and trade, but would also provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered and threatened species depend may be conserved, as well as helping to comply with the treaties and conventions under which our nation had pledged to conserve imperiled species. As the Supreme Court has recognized, the plain intent of Congress in enacting the ESA was to halt and reverse the trend towards species extinction, whatever the cost. This is reflected not only in the stated policies of the ESA, but in literally every section of the statute. The result is the most comprehensive legislation for the preservation of endangered species ever enacted by any nation. Unfortunately, we have had steady growth in the number of listed species in the last few decades, and that number is likely to climb due to climate change and continued habitat loss. Today, the list stands at 1,666 domestic species and more than 2,300 in total. And there are 550 more awaiting listing decisions, all during a time when Fish and Wildlife Service budgets have largely remained flat. As has been alluded to by the other panelists, the ESA works by establishing a framework for the conservation of imperiled species. First, to identify the species at risk of extinction, protect them from harm, recover them to the point where they don't need to be listed, and provide flexible permitting that ensures development won't contribute to species loss. First, the appropriate service determines whether a species warrants listing as endangered or threatened and designates critical habitat, i.e. those areas that are essential to the conservation of the species. Then the Act's protections kicked in. Direct prohibitions on take of individuals and destruction of habitat. And for federal agencies, Section 7's procedural and substantive provisions are intended to prevent federal actions from causing jeopardy to species or destroying or adversely modifying that critical habitat. The Act also obliges the services to develop recovery plans, as you heard about, to help address species needs, and it promotes partnerships between federal agencies, states, and the public to try to protect endangered and threatened species. Finally, the ESA provides a flexible framework that allows development to go forward in many instances, even if it may harm or kill individual members of a species. On federal lands, that is accomplished through Section 7 consultations, biological opinions, and incidental take statements, and on private lands through Section 10 habitat conservation planning and candidate conservation agreements. Thanks to the visionary goals and the flexible framework that Congress established, the Endangered Species Act is considered the world's most effective law for protecting wildlife in danger extinction. Very few species have been declared extinct since being put on the list, and many have recovered or are on the path to recovery, and that is a very laudable record. But there are limits to what the Endangered Species Act can do. And this chart, which is derived from work by Dale Goebel and Tim Mayle, among others, shows that 80% of species on the list are what is called conservation reliant, meaning that habitat loss, habitat degradation, succession of habitat may be affecting them and causing a decline, as opposed to simply overhunting or transient disturbances or pollution, which, if they were stopped, could theoretically bring the species back from the brink. Another factor is that studies have shown 80% of the funding for endangered species go to about 5% of species. So many species on the list simply are not getting the time and attention necessary for their recovery. So I just want to give one example. The lesser prairie chicken is a species you'll be hearing about this week because the Fish and Wildlife Service has an important decision to make about whether to list it again under the Act. It is an iconic grassland bird that has declined from more than 2 million animals to 38,000. It's lost 98% of its population, and it persists in just 17% of its historic habitat. Our own research shows that habitat loss continues, mostly due to energy development and agricultural conversion in recent years. This, there we go, is the process to list the lesser prairie chicken as endangered. It started with a petition in 1995. The bird then waited until 2012 before the service proposed listing. When it was finally listed in 2013, a federal court tossed the rule out on the grounds that the service didn't adequately consider conservation efforts that were in place for the species. So we re-petitioned the service in 2016 and then had to sue just to get the 12-month finding, which should be out this week. After that, the service will still have to produce a proposed rule, which will be subject to public comment, and perhaps we'll finally see a new listing in 2023, which will undoubtedly be subject to further litigation. The point being that it has been more than 30 years, or will probably be 30 years before this species is entitled to federal protection and we can begin the process of designing recovery plans. The Endangered Species Act is often analogized to an emergency room, but more often than not, it has a crowded waiting room that is chronically understaffed and lacks the basic resources to stabilize its patients. In the age of climate change, threats to fish, wildlife, and plants are only going to increase, and that will put additional pressure on the Endangered Species Act. So to get ahead of the biodiversity crisis, we're going to need not only more funding for those species in urgent need, but also new conservation strategies to protect habitats and to prevent the need to list. We've done a pretty good job focusing on extinction and endangered species, but we have underestimated the extent and consequences of biotic changes. I just want to read this passage from the wonderful book Beloved Beasts by Michelle Niehaus, which relates to this emergency room idea. She writes, "The concept of conservation biology as a crisis discipline and of conservation as a crisis response has undoubtedly contributed to the protection of both populations and species. But crises call for emergency measures, and emergency measures are almost always both costly and temporary. Barricades against disaster, enacted with little consideration of root causes or long-term consequences. The larger project of conservation, that of protecting the relationships that support all life on Earth, can't be accomplished with emergency measures alone. It has to start with common species." One might instead argue that it has to start with people. As Aldo Leopold also said, there are two things that interest me: the relation of people to each other and the relation of people to the land. He also said all ethics, so far evolved, rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. This idea of forging an ethical relationship with people and the land is the challenge of our time. Leopold also said that conservationists are just beginning to realize that their task involves the reorganization of society rather than the passage of some fish and game laws, and that is unfortunately a lesson that we are still learning. As theologian Thomas Berry called it, the great work before us is the task of moving modern industrial civilization from its present devastating influence on the earth to a more benign mode of presence. Earlier this year, Congressman Joe Neguse, Alan Lowenthal, and Jared Huffman called for a national commitment to, oops, I'm moving forward too fast. Let me go back. How do I go back? Back two, please. There we go. All right. Earlier this year, Congressman Joe Neguse and Alan Lowenthal and Jared Huffman called for a national commitment to addressing the biodiversity crisis by establishing a whole of government strategy that would ideally be developed through an interagency process announced by the president in an executive order. That strategy process would encourage agencies to identify and pursue a full range of actions within existing laws and policies, but also encourage consideration of new ones. It would promote accountability and progress in addressing the biodiversity crisis through a new quadrennial assessment. Among the notable items, some of which the Biden administration has embraced, is protection of 30% of lands and waters in the United States by 2030, developing climate adaptation and mitigation strategies, reasserting US leadership in global conservation, and rapidly building out renewable energy. All of these actions are critical, and they are mostly beyond the scope of the Endangered Species Act. And this is just one way in which I think conservationists are beginning to look beyond the Endangered Species Act to address the broader biodiversity crisis. As Holly de Ramos has indicated, nature advocates have obtained much of what they asked for, but they have not asked for what they really want. Hopefully that is now changing. I also since we're talking about intergenerational equity and expanding the scope of ethics, I would like to briefly mention the growing rights of nature movement. Rights of nature laws secure legal rights to the natural environment, including species and ecosystems. Legal rights include rights to exist, flourish, regenerate, evolve, and be restored. This movement reflects a growing understanding that nature deserves our respect, protection, and legal rights, but it is a fundamental shift in humankind's relationship with nature, one from use and exploitation to one of care and protection. It's growing in this movement is growing more in other nations than in the United States, but there are signs that it may be beginning to take hold in some communities. Because the fact is that our environmental laws are better at permitting destruction than stopping it. If we are in fact going to address the biodiversity and climate crises, we are going to need to transform institutions and governance, including our legal systems. And that apparently now includes the essential first step of restoring a democracy that is increasingly in peril. In Orange County, Florida, voters approved a right to clean water initiative, making that county the largest municipality in the United States to legalize the rights of nature. A lawsuit has now been filed under that law to oppose a housing development seeking to protect the waterway's intrinsic rights. The suit also claims that the development would disrupt the area's hydrology and violate the human right to clean water because of pollution runoff from new roads and buildings. A few years ago, I might have dismissed some of these ideas, but we are running out of time and we cannot continue to do the same things over and over and expect a different result. I don't like to talk generally about hope because hope, in my view, is simply another word for doing things without attachment to result. To quote Leopold one last time, that the situation is hopeless should not prevent us from doing our best. The only question, as Wendell Berry reminds us, is what is the right thing to do and what does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it? So just to close, I'd like to end with some words from Emily Johnson in a moving essay called Loving a Vanishing World, which is found in a wonderful anthology of writers The book is called All We Can Save. And she says, for better or for worse, we are the ones at the intersection of knowledge and agency. By fighting for social change, we aim at what the world can be and help other people see both the problem and the possibilities. This is also the power that Greta Thunberg and other youth climate strikers have. It is utterly self-evident to them that we must all change our lives to respond to this crisis, and the purity of their understanding is transmitted to us. In the world of your imagining, can you see children living who might have drowned, stable communities that might have burned, species hanging on, and understand these as things to fight for the rest of our lives? We can rejoin the web of life. We do not have to be its destroyer, but our last best chance is now, and countless tasks lie ahead of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. I thought that was a really fantastic presentation, and I especially really liked your analogy of the emergency room. I thought that was a really, really interesting and accurate way to put things. With that, I will turn things over to Jake.
Great, thanks, Chandler. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, and let's see if the slides are able to advance. Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks for having me, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Let me start off by saying that I view the ESA as having sort of two main goals. The first one is to prevent extinction, and the second one is to recover species to the point where they can be removed from the ESA list. And from an intergenerational perspective, I think the most urgent goal is to prevent species extinction. That is to maintain for future generations what we have today. And that was already discussed by some of our prior speakers, including Jason. My view is that we're actually not achieving this goal very well for many species, even those goals, species that have been listed for decades. So my central premise is that if we want the ESA to steward intergenerational well-being, we're going to have to do a much better job and do things very differently moving forward so as to preserve that type of well-being. First, the good news, as some of the prior speakers have mentioned, this ESA has seen some really good success at recovering over 60 species, many of those in the last decade. Downlisting over 30 species from endangered to threatened, and likely preventing the extinction of hundreds of species. So there's a lot to celebrate here. But despite these successes, I think we really need to pay a lot more attention to the large number of species that continue to decline after listing, or that persist at dangerously low abundances despite listing. These are the species that are underwater in this iceberg analogy. These are the species and populations that present the greatest challenge from an intergenerational perspective, because they're the ones that future generations are most likely never to see. So I want to talk about a few categories of species that are listed that I think we really need to pay a lot more attention to. Let me start off with the first one here, which are species that are just incredibly close to extinction. Many of these species, probably the average person and even most conservationists have not heard of. So one example is the ring-ping mussel, listed in 1989, only 2 found in the last 15 years, despite extensive searches. This species may already be functionally extinct at this point. Another example are the dozens of Hawaiian plants, like the one on the slide here, that are still unable to meet the most basic criteria for preventing extinction, despite having been listed for almost 3 decades, right? So I'm not even talking about the criteria for downlisting or delisting the species. There are actually separate criteria for Hawaiian plants for preventing extinction. And if you read the most recent 5-year reviews for many of those plants, they haven't even met those extinction prevention goals. So the St. John Kala here is extinct in the wild, and all outplanted specimens have died, right? So really perilously close to losing some of these species. The second category I want to talk about is that even for species that are reasonably abundant today, many of them are in long-term decline, and some of them have no foreseeable path to recovery at the moment. And one example I want to bring up, which is very intriguing in my mind, is the American burying beetle. It was actually downlisted in October of 2020. So that's a great success because some threats have been ameliorated, some populations have increased in abundance. But that very downlisting rule actually talks about how the southern plains population, which is the one circled in red here, is anticipated to become entirely extirpated by mid-century of this, roughly 2050. And it's because of projected increases in summer maximum temperatures above 95 degrees. So that southern plains populations make up 60% of all suitable habitat for the species, right? So this isn't extinction per se. This isn't sort of the 1% figure that Jason had mentioned before, but this is mass scale extirpation. And we don't currently have a metric under the ESA to capture mass scale extirpation. But if you read a lot of 5-year reviews, like what I do on my spare time, you can see that there are a lot of species experiencing what appears to be pretty significant population declines. And indeed, there is a study in 2016, and this is in Issues in Ecology, the citation is at the bottom of the slide, that found that roughly half of all species with a recovery plan through 2014 were in some level of long-term decline, and many of these species have been listed for a really long time. A third category I wanted to flag are species that will become, for lack of a better term, climate refugees. Ones that will lose most of all of their habitat in the coming decades because of climate change effects. One example is the Florida key deer, and the most recent 5-year review for the species indicates that most of the species' habitat will become lost to saltwater inundation or affected by saltwater intrusion. So this is a species that presents an extreme case where, as far as we can tell, or as far as I can tell, the species' entire habitat will become lost in the next few decades. And it's going to have to be translocated if we're even going to preserve the Florida key deer. And it won't even exist probably in the Florida Keys. It might exist somewhere else. And so there are a number of ethical, legal, science questions around what do we do to conserve the Florida key deer? And is it even recoverable if it doesn't exist in its native range anymore? So what do we do about all of this? First is, if you look at the data, I think it's really clear that there are some species currently with no path to recovery. But I do think we can do a much better job at stabilizing species and preventing their extinction. So first is that I think we need to do a much better job reallocating funding to prioritize species extinction and stabilization of species that are in a long-term decline. As Jason mentioned earlier, that 2016 study I mentioned found that 80% of all state and federal funding for endangered species goes to just 5% of species. And that there's a separate study by Professor Leah Gerber, it's cited at the bottom of the slide, that found that many species are in this category of what's called injurious neglect, which means that they're being funded at far less than what their recovery plan says is needed, and their status is in decline, right? So these are species that are essentially neglected, and they're neglected to their detriment. So this is, I think, a really, really important target for reallocating funding to prioritize further declines. Another sort of policy move, as mentioned by one or two of our speakers earlier, is I think we need to start thinking about far more aggressive use of translocation. I know the conservation community tends to be sort of very on the edge and perhaps somewhat risk averse about this, and probably for good reasons. Historically, there have been a number of concerns about aggressive translocation. There was actually a paper that just came out a few months ago that assessed all translocations under the ESA and found that by and large, almost all of them were effective or appear to be effective. So the jury appears to have said that at least translocation seems to be can be a very effective tool for many species. But under the ESA, we actually still don't have a framework for assessing the cost of conducting a translocation versus the cost of not doing it, right? Oftentimes, there's a lot of focus on the cost of pursuing a risky or controversial conservation measure, but not enough consideration on the cost of inaction. And in the context of climate change, there are some very significant costs to doing nothing, right? Doing nothing doesn't preserve the status quo. For many of these species, doing nothing actually means continued declines. Another sort of move I think we need to think is a national strategy for how we're going to deal with climate adaptation for ESA species, for species like the key deer I mentioned, key largo wood rat, polar bears, many freshwater fish and snails that depend on dwindling water supplies in the Southwest, and so forth. We don't really have a framework at the moment for how we're going to help these species confront and manage the absolute worst consequences of climate change. I do think it's noteworthy, though, that the National Park Service recently released an umbrella framework for confronting the very difficult reality that they simply cannot maintain some national parks in their current state because of climate change, and that many of the natural resources in these parks will actually be lost, and there's almost nothing that can be done about this. So that framework is appropriately called Resist, Accept, and Direct. And it really focuses on, we are going to lose certain resources, but what can we preserve, and how can we sort of redirect our efforts to do the best job we can, given the not so great cards that are dealt to us. And then the last thing I'll say is that I really think that ESA is not enough as even a law of last resort, to say nothing of conserving ecosystems and all of these other objectives. I think there are a number of things that, if you read 5-year reviews and recovery plans for listed species, the Fish and Wildlife Service is basically acknowledging, there's not much we can do about this type of threat. And so a recent example I read comes from the diamond trionia snail, highly, highly imperiled, found in the Southwest. And that 5-year review says that regulatory mechanisms to manage aquifers that support this species are inadequate against future habitat loss and degradation, because many of those water withdrawals happen at the local and state level, and the ESA simply has no reach to those types of non-federal actions. And so I see language like this over and over again. I see it in some of the salamander 5-year reviews in Texas, and many other freshwater aquatic reviews. So I really think we need to think a lot more about other laws and programs beyond the ESA. I think the ESA can be sort of a conductor of the orchestra, but we don't necessarily have all the players in the orchestra at the moment to preserve biodiversity for future generations. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jake. I thought that was a really, really nice overview, and I liked a lot of your suggestions as well. We will now move right into our Q&A session. So just as a reminder to our participants to please enter any questions that you have into GoTo's question box. I do see a question right now. I think this is a really interesting question. I think it can actually be broader than how it's written. So I'm going to read the question first and then reframe it. But the question is, in Maine, there is a conflict between wind farm development to address climate change and fear of lobstermen that it will impact their livelihood. Is there a role for the ESA process to help address and reconcile these concerns? I think we can actually broaden that too beyond wind farms, and also look at some land developments and solar farms, as solar farms we know will take quite a bit of land use. And I was hoping someone could address the tension between fighting climate change through changing our energy development, and as well as the ESA and protecting endangered species. So maybe Jake or Jason, you want to start this off, and we can round robin it.
Sure, Chandler, I'm happy to just speak very briefly. So I think in terms of concrete action, the Biden administration really needs to move forward with some concrete and robust mitigation policies and strategies for endangered species, because at the end of the day, we want clean, renewable energy and we want biodiversity. And I think the only way to sort of reconcile that conflict is to have really good avoidance, minimization, and effective compensatory mitigation actions. The Obama administration did release what I thought were some really good ESA mitigation policies. The Trump administration rescinded that. So I think good mitigation approaches are going to be a really important priority for this administration to address that issue. Thanks.
And I would just agree with that. I think, the Section 7 permitting process, the consultation process, as well as the habitat conservation planning process allow for projects like this to undertake really systematic review of impacts to species. I know with land-based wind, we spent a lot of time, and I served as an advisor to a federal advisory committee that looked at ways to mitigate the impacts of wind development on birds and bat species. And there are best practices and guidelines that can be put in place so that we can ensure that we do move rapidly toward clean energy, which we must for all species, but do so in a way that does not cause a jeopardy to individual species that may be in the specific vicinity of those facilities. And that's the job. It may be difficult, but that's what we have to do.
Great, thank you. Tundi, do you have anything to add?
I'm muted. No, there we go. I just want to add that I think it's, I don't think we should assume that renewable energy development is necessarily harmful for individual species as it evolves and the technology is becoming better and better and better at mitigating impacts to vulnerable species or sensitive species. On the marine side, and there's a lot of examples of, endangered species cohabiting areas with wind farms and other kinds of renewable energy developments in the sea. And actually, that the renewable energy in some ways is a de facto protected area. So adding additional protections beyond, just the protections offered by the Endangered Species Act. So while I think it is a conundrum that we need to harness technologies that may have an impact in order to tackle climate change, it's absolutely imperative that we tackle climate change and work very hard to, advance the technology to the point where the impact is really minimized.
And Lorena, did you have anything to add?
No, basically everybody said pretty much what I was thinking as well. We really have to look at all that's available to us to try to do. And for the Fish and Wildlife Service, it's within the, like Jason said, through consultation and HCPs. And we worked the same thing that he talked about. We're very familiar with that panel, and we're actually implementing those things now here in Hawaii. We just got them, and we'll be doing that for birds and bats. And we've been using brand new things like using dogs to help locate areas and be able to monitor for the amount of take that's going on. And I think that's just going to continue. That's what we'll have to do. We have to find better ways to meet the challenges that we'll be facing.
And if I can just jump back in, this is probably a very naive thing to say, but I think we veered towards kind of ethical questions in all of our presentations. And, ultimately, I think we're going to have to find ways to consume less, whether it's energy or any other thing as a planet. If we're really interested in intergenerational well-being, then it's not going to be enough to just keep consuming at the rates that we're consuming. We're going to have to find ways to roll that back a little bit and live more modestly on the planet.
Did anyone want to follow up to that point? All right. Well, moving on to another question that we received. This one is for Jason, but anyone who wants to jump into it, please feel free to do so. But Jason, the question is, how viable is the rights of nature theory in terms of financing lawsuits on behalf of a natural entity such as a river?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. We are seeing some successes in the rights of nature movement in other countries. In New Zealand, for example, an agreement was worked out to declare personhood to a river which represented interests of indigenous Maori people that were there, but also activists that were interested in trying to get additional protections for that. In Ecuador, it has been, the rights of nature principles have been included in their constitution. There's a long list of these types of actions that have occurred around the world that I know the Center for Environmental and Democratic Rights keeps on their website. Here in the US, we are, I mentioned the example in Orange County. There have been other attempts to bring cases around rights of rivers in particular that have not yet succeeded or moved through the process long enough. I'd also point to the Our Children's Trust litigation, which is a little bit different, but which has been attracting a lot of attention in federal courts as they try to assert rights to atmospheric trust responsibilities that the federal government has to people now and in future generations. So I think, ideas about whether trees should have standing have been around since the 70s. Our legal system has moved largely in the opposite direction of some of these ideas, but the environmental laws under which we all labor are now themselves 50 years old. And in the time that I have been practicing law, we have seen very few innovations in terms of a next generation of environmental law and policy. And so I think people are turning to these rights of nature ideas as a way of stepping outside of the box that we have been in, recognizing the political environment that we are in is difficult to make changes to the laws that we have, and just trying to create a new paradigm, because I think as we've all recognized in various ways on this panel, things are going to have to change dramatically if we're going to get a handle on the biodiversity and climate crisis. So I would just say stay tuned, look at initiatives that are going on around the country, and plug in with groups that focus more on rights of nature, and see where this can go, because what it is trying to do is really to transform our legal system in a way that we have yet to see, that has not yet occurred.
Thank you. Did anyone want to add anything to that? All right, we've got more of a general question. This isn't really directed to anyone, but anyone who wants to take this one up, please feel free to do so. This question says, is it possible to move beyond an individual species approach for protections without a legislative change? Or will new legislation be necessary?
I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to answer the legal the legal part of it. That is a legal question that I will jump in just to say that I think the question is getting at kind of ecosystem listings versus species listings, and that's something that the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has been doing very successfully with developing criteria for red listed ecosystems. And I think, I don't know, I would defer to the lawyers on the panel who know, but I would imagine that would require a whole new piece of legislation. But I think it's a direction that we should definitely go in. And I think many countries in the world are looking at ecosystem protections now.
I guess I would just add to that the Endangered Species Act contains many provisions that speak to habitat protection. And in the very initial purposes of the Act, protection of the ecosystems on which they depend was a declared congressional goal. In practice, it's a little bit harder to achieve, but there are mechanisms to consider multiple species in habitat conservation planning or in candidate conservation agreements that the service has explored and I think could do a lot more with. But the nature of the Act is that species are listed one by one, and that takes a tremendous amount of time and effort on the part of the Fish and Wildlife Service to go through those listing processes, develop critical habitat, and then develop individualized recovery plans for those species. So the more that we can begin to look at ecosystemic approaches, either in the ESA or outside of the ESA with broader mechanisms like the 30 by 30 plan, like connectivity, wildlands movements, things like that, whatever it is that can put more lands and waters in some kind of protected status, the more we'll get a handle on not only protecting keystone endangered species, but all of the common species that we've talked about are in significant decline and may not be common much longer.
And Chandler, I'll just pose three really quick thoughts for the person who asked that question. First is to consider or take a look at some of these multi-species habitat conservation plans, because that's basically an example of using the ESA's existing Section 10 authority to conserve multiple species across the landscape. Second is to look at some of the multi-species recovery plans. So a bunch of Hawaiian plants are covered by 2 to 3 really large recovery plans. South Florida has an ecosystems level recovery plan. California vernal pools are covered by some multi-species recovery plans. My opinion is some of those plans aren't great. They tend to sort of just be more of a, whatever species we don't quite know too much about, we'll sort of put them on the plan. And there's actually a scientific assessment of that. If you look at a 2001 Society for Conservation Biology review of multi-species plans. So that might be a good resource for the person who posed the question. So I think there's still much better ways to do multi-species recovery planning, but that is something that has already been done for well over 2 decades.
Excellent. Oh, I'm sorry, did I cut you off, Lorena?
I was just going to add that, yeah, in terms of implementing things, like I said, in Hawaii, that's what we've done. We can't list within the last couple of years or decade, I said, when we went through our massive amounts of listing, we didn't do them one at a time. We would never have gotten them done. We listed several hundred within a couple of years, and we had to put them all together. And so I understand about what Jake says about like our recovery plans may not be all the greatest when you look at putting them together, like from an island perspective, but you have to also understand that we have to use the best available information at the time. And we don't have the funds to go out and do all the scientific research to get all the information on these. Also, a lot of our species are also like what Jake said, we have very limited numbers of them. We are highly endemic species in very small areas that are almost virtually unreachable, where they're existing is on cliff faces that we have to rappel down at, life and limb and looking at from a helicopter type thing, It's very intense with regard to the amount of information, what's available, and then the timing under which we have to do them. Recovery plans have to be done within a particular time frame of when they were listed, when they're finally, when final rules come into play. So within a short period of time, we have to get all of this put together. And in Hawaii, we're looking at hundreds, right? Like I told you, out of the over 1,600 that are listed, we have very close or a little bit more than 600 of them that we have to manage in our office alone, right? So that's quite an effort. And like what Jason and Jake said about the amount of money that goes to us, given we have the largest number. You can look at our budgets and they are nowhere near being like, in respect to amount of endangered species that we have to manage. Given all of that, I still think we have looked very much at doing things in an ecosystem fashion, looking at them in other ways. So would it be easier for us? Yes, if the laws were more specific about that and provided those kinds of things about ecosystems, yes. But we also, as scientists, we're all scientists, or most of us are, really look at what can we do, what's the best way to protect this species? And it really is ecosystem protection and large landscape level protection. And that's what we're trying to do using the laws that exist.
Excellent. We received another question here, again, touching on climate change. It says, with climate change moving habitats, how can ESA keep up with new habitat locations and protections? By moving the recovery plans? So I think maybe Lorena, you might be best suited to start that off.
So I would say that that's, one of our challenges, right? I mean, like one of the things that I talked about was the changing administration and our ability either to even say anything with regard to say anything. Oh, I'm sorry.
We lost your video, but we can still hear you.
Oh, okay. It's like everything is kind of my whole thing went gone, disappeared, and then it just popped up again. Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Just lost my train of thought. Okay.
Would you like me to repeat the question?
Yeah, it's doing that again. I lost everything again, but I can hear you. So
we can still hear you as well.
Okay.
The question was, with climate change moving habitats, how can ESA keep up with new habitat locations and protections by moving recovery plans? Excuse me.
Yeah. So what we're doing is really looking at, like I said, the distribution and landscape modeling, and those modeling help us to incorporate all the current information and then project into the future. And so that's what we're doing, is looking at these levels. And one of the primary things, or one of the greatest challenges we're facing here in the Pacific, is with our native forest birds and their susceptibility to mosquitoes and avian malaria that the mosquitoes carry. And as temperatures rise, the level of where the mosquitoes can reach are increasing. And as they go, it's sort of like what happens to the birds. And so we can't change the habitat. We're not going to be able to make it cooler in areas to reduce the amount of mosquitoes. So what we're doing is trying to tackle the mosquitoes themselves. So we're working at trying to find ways to eradicate them so we don't create that in that sense. So habitat-wise, it depends on the threats, right, for endangered species and what they're actually facing with the climate change. In other places, like I had mentioned, our modeling shows that a lot of our low-lying islets will come underwater, or actually be covered during large storms. And so because of that, we're working to move and translocate seabirds onto the higher islands and looking at those things. And that takes a little bit of time, but we're going to do it now, because if we're looking at 30 years from now and seeing all those places going underwater, we're doing that now. So the modeling is really what's helping us aim towards that and incorporating those ideas about climate change. Other than that, I don't exactly know what else we're going to be coming up with. And all our recovery plans currently are addressing those kinds of things too. So
I guess I could also add to that. A year ago, I wrote an article for the Environmental Law Reporter on the definition of habitat under the Endangered Species Act, and this was a response to the Supreme Court's decision in the Weyerhaeuser versus Fish and Wildlife Service case involving designated of unoccupied critical habitat for the dusky gopher frog. And then last year, the Trump administration published a definition of habitat that was pretty narrow in terms of the ability to designate unoccupied habitat that could be essential to the conservation of species in the future. And that regulation is now in litigation by me and a whole bunch of other organizations. But that is really kind of the crux of what the issue is there. If we are going to protect habitat for species, and we want to do that with an eye toward what the species is going to need in the foreseeable future, we may want to be identifying critical habitat and recovery areas that go beyond where a species currently lives, and perhaps even beyond where a species currently can live, recognizing that some areas will require restoration and other areas may be changing as a result of climate change, and species ranges may shift. So, it also is a kind of a question of resources, but if we want to be more forward thinking, we can be. The question, I think, still remains whether the law as written allows us to do that. I think it does, but the Supreme Court has said that critical habitat must, if nothing else, be habitat. So how we define habitat kind of matters. I guess the only other thing I would add is, with climate change, a lot of species are facing multiple.
Jump in too and just say that I think this is beyond the scope of the
We lost you, Tundi. Were you going to say?
US jurisdiction and the ESA, but a lot of the movements are going to be taking our listed species, and the distributions will be so the need for international bilateral agreements to jointly recover species will be increased, I think.
And that, I mean, that's an excellent point. I mean, I worked on a species called the red knot that winters in Tierra del Fuego and breeds up in the Arctic and has stopovers in many places along the way, particularly along the Delaware Bay here in the United States. The service is considering designation of critical habitat, but protection of species like that, protection of species like the monarch butterfly are going to depend on protection of wide ranges of habitats across many jurisdictions. The only other point I was going to make, I know we're running out of time, is just some species are facing significant stressors that climate change exacerbates, and I'm thinking about the manatee. And the manatee was considered an Endangered Species Act success story. It went from about 1,300 species to maybe 6,000. But in this year alone, more than 432 have died as a result of starvation that scientists believe is the result of primarily herbicide pollution in Florida waterways, and that is going to require significant changes in our use of land if we're going to address that, because herbicides like glyphosate kill the seagrasses and cause deadly algal blooms, and you add climate change to that and changing sea temperatures, and you see areas that used to be prime habitat for manatees that may no longer be without intervention.
Jake, did you have any final thoughts? All right. Well, we have run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much to our audience for joining us today and for your many thought-provoking questions. We hope you'll continue to watch this space in the years ahead. And an enormous thank you to our outstanding panelists, Tundi, Jake, Jason, and Lorena. Just really appreciate your many contributions to today's program. Thank you all so much again, and please take care and stay safe. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having
Bye.
us.
Pleasure to be here.
Cheers.
Take care, everyone.